In recent weeks, the fighting around Toretsk has looked deceptively quiet. No large armored columns, no artillery barrages lighting up the horizon. Instead, a small convoy of Russian motorcycles moved quickly through broken streets and dirt roads, spreading out to avoid attention. The riders believed speed and dispersion would keep them unseen. They were wrong. In today's war, movement alone is enough to be noticed. Toretsk is not a story about a single battle or a decisive strike. It is a snapshot of how modern war now unfolds. Slowly, quietly, often without warning. This is a battlefield shaped less by firepower and more by observation. Less by heroic charges and more by timing, restraint, and judgment. What happened here reveals how the war in Ukraine is being fought now, and why seeing first often matters more than shooting first. The moment the Russian motorcycle convoy entered the outskirts of Toretsk, the engagement was no longer about firepower, but about information. Footage from Ukrainian reconnaissance drones was transmitted in real time to nearby fire control teams, creating a continuous picture of movement on the ground rather than a single snapshot. Instead of rushing to strike, operators tracked direction, spacing, speed, and pauses, building a clear pattern of how the convoy moved through damaged streets and narrow access routes. According to analysts at the Institute for the Study of War, persistent drone surveillance has become one of Ukraine's most effective tools, not because it destroys targets immediately, but because it reduces uncertainty on the battlefield. What mattered most was not where the convoy was, but where it would be. As the motorcycles advanced, Ukrainian teams adjusted their fire plans based on live drone data. Routes were mapped second by second, allowing crews to identify choke points where speed would drop and escape options would narrow. This type of tracking reflects a modern sensor-to-shooter chain, where observation, decision, and action are linked through digital systems rather than radio guesswork. Military researchers at RAND have noted that this real-time integration shortens decision cycles and gives smaller units a decisive edge against mobile targets. Yet no attack followed immediately. Ukraine's choice to wait was deliberate and calculated, shaped by experience gained over months of drone-driven combat. Striking too early risks scattering targets, exposing firing positions, and drawing counterfire from unknown directions. By holding fire, Ukrainian units allowed the convoy to move deeper into an area already shaped by terrain and pre-planned angles of control. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute have described this approach as space control rather than target hunting, where the goal is to limit enemy choices before any weapon is fired. This patience marks a sharp break from older models of warfare. In previous conflicts, speed often meant acting first. In Ukraine, speed increasingly means deciding later, but with better information. Drone operators did not act as attackers. They functioned as battlefield managers, feeding constant updates to fire teams while remaining unseen. Each adjustment refined the ambush, reducing the need for large forces or prolonged engagement. According to CSIS research on Ukraine's drone war, delaying contact often leads to fewer shots fired and higher success rates once contact begins. Toretsk illustrates how modern combat has shifted from destroying enemies to shaping their movement. By the time the motorcycles approached the chosen engagement zone, Ukrainian units already knew where they would slow down, where they would cluster, and where they would struggle to turn back. This level of awareness allowed commanders to plan limited strikes instead of broad assaults. No single unit needed to see the full picture, because the drone feed acted as a shared set of eyes above the battlefield. Equally important was what Ukrainian forces chose not to do. They did not attempt to chase the convoy across open ground, nor did they seek immediate confirmation kills. Such restraint reflects lessons learned from years of attritional fighting, where overextension often leads to losses without strategic gain. Defense analysts frequently point out that Ukraine's battlefield success comes less from superior weapons and more from disciplined use of information and timing. In this sense, Toretsk is not an isolated incident. It represents a broader transformation in how war is fought, where control of space matters more than control of territory, and where the first decisive move is often invisible. The ambush was already complete before the first weapon was activated, shaped quietly by observation, coordination, and restraint. When the moment was finally chosen, the attack did not need to last long. The first moments of contact between Ukrainian forces and the Russian motorcycle convoy did not unfold like a Hollywood battle scene, but rather like a carefully guided collapse of order. As the convoy entered the designated engagement zone, select motorcycles were disabled by precision strikes, halting them in place and breaking their pace rhythm. These initial hits did not rely on sheer firepower or sweeping barrages. Instead, they targeted individual vehicles in ways that shut down motion without turning the space into indiscriminate chaos. Military experts note that limiting the first strikes to key targets helps prevent rapid dispersal of enemy fighters and preserves opportunities for controlled follow-up actions. Within seconds, the Russian riders found themselves in an unexpected and escalating dilemma. Attacked from angles they had not considered, their formation dissolved as riders instinctively sought cover or scattered into sidetracks. When movement becomes unpredictable, cohesion collapses, and this was precisely what happened. A small number of accurate hits can have an outsized effect on morale, especially when those hits create confusion at the front and uncertainty at the rear. According to battlefield psychology research, disorientation in confined or complex terrain can spread faster than physical injury, often degrading unit effectiveness almost instantly. Unlike frontal charges that aim to overwhelm by mass, this engagement avoided reckless pursuit or uncontrolled aggression. Ukrainian units refrained from launching a broad offensive, and there was no widespread chase across open ground that might have exposed them to counterattacks or traps. Instead, they measured every movement, conserving their position and maintaining disciplined control over their own actions. This restraint is historically rare in open combat and represents an evolution in tactical thinking where calculated engagements are preferred to impulsive assaults. Military theorists have argued that restraint can be as powerful as aggression when it denies the opponent clear opportunities to regroup. The psychological shock of precision fire in a constrained space was as consequential as the physical damage itself. For the Russian riders, what began as a routine movement transformed in moments into a scenario of uncertainty and danger. They were struck unexpectedly, forcing them to choose between risky retreat, unpredictable maneuvering, or seeking cover in unfamiliar terrain. The effect of this controlled chaos was to degrade not only the convoy's mobility, but also its ability to think and act coherently. Studies on modern engagements show that when a unit loses organizational rhythm early, its odds of recovery diminish rapidly, even if its numbers remain largely intact. By focusing attacks on specific points rather than launching an all-out offensive, Ukrainian forces shaped a battlefield environment that worked against the convoy's survival instinct. This technique differs from overwhelming an enemy through superior numbers or firepower. Instead, it exploits the very structure of small mobile units, where isolated hits can sever communication and strategic intent. Urban warfare analysts have observed that light vehicles and dispersed troops are especially vulnerable when faced with precise, directional strikes that diminish their ability to coordinate. In the narrow approaches around Toretsk, space itself became a tactical factor. The winding roads, broken pavement, and makeshift debris left from earlier battles created natural bottlenecks. In such environments, mobility becomes a double-edged sword. While motorcycles can evade larger weapons, they are also more easily pinned when routes narrow. The initial strike exploited these spatial limits, forcing the convoy into a psychological trap where every choice seemed riskier than the last. Observers of ground engagements often emphasize the power of terrain to shape outcomes even before the first shot is fired. As the dust and confusion settled, it became clear that this was no disorderly skirmish, but a controlled disruption designed to exploit weakness without unnecessary escalation. There were no reckless charges, no pursuit across exposed fields, no cries of confusion in the ranks of the ambushers. Every action had a purpose tied to restricting choices and amplifying uncertainty for the opponent. In this way, the initial strike fulfilled its role not by sheer force, but by precisely bending the engagement to Ukrainian advantage with minimal exposure to risk. In this phase of the fight, the distinct roles of each type of unit began to emerge. In the aftermath of the initial engagement, the battlefield around Toretsk shifted from raw confrontation to precise pressure, and nowhere was this clearer than in how FPV drones and snipers were used. First-person view FPV drones became the backbone of continued pressure against the disintegrating Russian motorcycle convoy, not by blasting open fields with heavy explosives, but by picking off remaining vehicles and light transport with remarkable accuracy. These small, agile drones operated at low altitude, swooping in and out of view, while high-resolution cameras relayed every movement back to operators hiding in covered positions. According to a recent report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, FPV drones have reshaped many Ukrainian battlefields by enabling rapid, pinpoint strikes with lower risk to friendly forces. Because the drones could track even minor movements, they reduced the enemy's available space to maneuver and regroup. Instead of letting riders disperse into the landscape, FPV units pursued them like shadows, forcing any remaining Russian fighters into tighter, more limited areas. As the space for escape shrank, the psychological weight of being watched from above squeezed decision-making speed and increased hesitation. A study published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies emphasizes how persistent aerial observation can break an opponent's will to act by making even small movements risky. In this evolving fight, snipers played a role that contrasted sharply with popular ideas about lone marksmen waiting on rooftops. Rather than starring as heroic figures eliminating enemies with dramatic headshots, snipers in Toretsk worked strategically to seal off exit routes and limit escape options for the Russian convoy. Their fire was not meant to dazzle or daunt an audience. It was coordinated with real-time drone feeds so that every aimed shot served a specific tactical purpose. This approach differs from the romanticized portrayal often seen in films or online clips, where snipers are shown as isolated warriors acting independently. In reality, their effectiveness depends heavily on teamwork, communication, and precise timing, matching movements observed by drones with fields of fire that restrict retreat and regrouping. The combination of FPV drones and sniper teams created a form of operational pressure that was continuous rather than explosive. Even when no weapon fired for several moments, the presence of drones overhead and snipers watching from concealed positions prevented opponents from making confident decisions. This sustained tension slowed movement and confined the remaining vehicles to narrow routes where the chance of interception increased. Research into urban battlefield dynamics suggests that such persistent pressure can degrade an adversary's cohesion as effectively as direct assault, especially when escape becomes psychologically taxing. Importantly, the way these tools were employed challenges some common assumptions about modern ground combat. Many outside observers assume that drones are only useful for dramatic strikes, or that snipers operate in isolation like legends on a battlefield. In practice, the two work together as parts of an integrated system, feeding information and suppressing freedom of movement rather than seeking grand, individual feats. The real measure of success was not the number of vehicles destroyed, but the degree to which remaining elements of the convoy were forced into positions where further action became negligible or too risky. That shift from dramatic destruction to controlled containment marks a key difference between real combat and its portrayal in media or propaganda. On social platforms and in some wartime commentary, FPV drones are sometimes shown attacking like guided missiles, while snipers are depicted taking long-range shots under perfect conditions. On the ground, conditions were far more complex. Operators had to balance aggression with patience, choosing moments that maximize strategic effect without overexposing their own positions. Experts from the Ukraine Defense Contact Group note that this blend of tools reflects a broader tactical evolution toward information dominance and controlled targeting rather than sheer firepower alone. Through this integration, Ukrainian units managed to seal the area around Toretsk without spilling into reckless confrontation. The drones wrapped invisible pressure around every route, and the snipers locked down key corridors, reducing options piece by piece. These actions gradually dissolved the convoy's ability to act as a coherent unit. By the time the engagement reached its logical conclusion, opponents found themselves boxed in not by numbers, but by the combined effect of sustained awareness and restricted movement. When the target had been neutralized, the next critical question was not about further attack, but about knowing when to stop. After the controlled disruption of the motorcycle convoy, Ukrainian forces did not immediately launch a broad pursuit, but instead focused on stabilizing the area they had just cleared. Once pressure from drones and coordinated fire had weakened the enemy's capacity to maneuver, Ukrainian units moved in to secure the key access routes and points of cover that the convoy had passed through. Securing these areas did not mean unleashing fresh assaults. It involved careful observation, clearing pockets of potential danger, and making certain that no untended threats remained. According to reporting from the United States Institute of Peace, disciplined ground consolidation after an engagement helps prevent counterattacks and reduces the risk of ambush for advancing troops. As the terrain around Toretsk fell under more secure Ukrainian control, troops pushed toward nearby hideouts where remaining elements of the opposing group might be sheltering. This phase was not marked by hasty action, but by deliberate steps that ensured each block and intersection was understood before units passed through. Operators worked with additional drone feeds to check forward positions and examined terrain features that might conceal residual resistance. This careful advance differs sharply from older ideas of taking ground at all costs. It favors a measured pace that keeps soldiers safe while maintaining tactical advantage. Analysts at the Atlantic Council point out that modern engagements increasingly reward this sort of attritional control over reckless forward motion. Warnings or signals of remaining fighters were not ignored, yet Ukrainian commanders chose not to escalate fighting unless direct threats were confirmed. Avoiding unnecessary combat in newly secured areas reduced the chance of accidental clashes and civilian harm. It also prevented the kind of fragmented engagements that can tear at unit cohesion and exhaust soldiers. A study published by the Modern War Institute highlights how maintaining discipline after initial success limits distraction and preserves combat power for future operations. In changes like these, the battle around Toretsk reflects broader lessons emerging from the Ukraine conflict about how best to hold territory once it has been won. Holding ground without overreach means knowing when to solidify control and when to hold position rather than pushing deeper without sufficient information. This restraint is rooted in the hard experience of attritional warfare, where extended supply lines, isolated units, and unknown terrain can turn gains into liabilities. Military scholars frequently note that overextension often invites counterattacks and unnecessary casualties when defenders exploit gaps left by advancing forces. For the Ukrainian troops involved, this meant establishing secure forward positions near the convoy's last known route and adjacent shelter points, then pausing to reorient and reallocate resources before any further action. This methodical approach gave commanders the chance to assess threats, account for all units, and confirm that no remnants of the convoy were regrouping nearby. It also allowed engineers and support personnel to begin clearing obstacles or hazards that could threaten movement later. The emphasis was on prevention, not prosecution, a subtle but significant shift in the way ground is managed after an engagement. Research from the RAND Corporation shows that this practice reduces both casualties and the likelihood of unintended clashes with non-combatants. This calm, measured advance did more than secure physical space. It reinforced a psychological edge for Ukrainian forces. Knowing that their commanders valued calculated actions over rash pursuits helped build trust within the ranks and confidence in decision-making. Soldiers understood that their safety and mission success were not being traded for impulsive aggression. In conflicts where morale and cohesion matter as much as firepower, this type of discipline can shape future engagements, encouraging troops to rely on collective planning rather than instinctive reaction. Importantly, this moment in Toretsk showcases a broader shift in how modern militaries think about battlefield momentum. Winning a fight is not always about pushing forward until every inch of ground is claimed. Instead, it often involves holding what has been gained with vigilance and restraint, understanding that the next threat may not be visible at first glance. This mindset acknowledges that control is dynamic and fragile, and that careful consolidation can be more strategic than continuous advance. A different situation later in the conflict further highlights how choosing not to fire can be just as valuable as choosing when to shoot. In a separate operation, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces encountered a situation that tested judgment more than courage. During a close-range reconnaissance mission, SOF units detected enemy troops occupying a multi-story building that had been prepared for defense. The structure offered clear firing lanes, protected positions, and limited access points, giving the defending force a strong tactical advantage. For the Ukrainians observing from outside, the picture was clear within minutes. Any direct assault would face concentrated fire from above and from narrow corridors below. The imbalance was not subtle. The opposing force held superior numbers and heavier weapons inside a fortified position, while the SOF team operated with limited manpower and no guarantee of rapid reinforcement. Military doctrine has long warned against frontal attacks on prepared defenses, especially in urban terrain where elevation and confined spaces multiply risk. The U.S. Army's field manuals on urban operations stress that even elite units can suffer heavy losses when attacking a defended structure without clear advantage or surprise. Faced with these conditions, Ukrainian commanders made a decision that rarely appears in dramatic combat footage. They withdrew. The retreat was executed methodically. Personnel pulled back in stages, tracks were obscured, and no equipment was left behind. Contact was broken before the opposing force fully understood what had happened. According to analysis from the Modern War Institute at West Point, disciplined withdrawals like this preserve combat power and often prevent future losses that would weaken long-term operational capacity. This choice reflects a form of battlefield maturity that is often misunderstood outside professional military circles. Withdrawal is frequently framed as failure, especially in public narratives shaped by propaganda or entertainment. In reality, avoiding an unwinnable fight protects experienced personnel who will be needed in future operations. NATO training doctrine repeatedly emphasizes that preserving force readiness is as important as seizing ground, particularly in prolonged conflicts where attrition shapes outcomes more than single engagements. The SOF decision also highlights how modern warfare rewards judgment over impulse. By refusing to escalate a situation that favored the defender, Ukrainian forces avoided unnecessary casualties and denied the enemy an opportunity to claim a symbolic victory. Defense analysts at RAND have noted that elite units succeed not by constant engagement, but by choosing battles that align with broader operational goals rather than emotional pressure. In the context of the Ukraine war, this incident sends a quiet but powerful message. Not every discovery leads to an attack. Not every advantage must be pressed immediately. Sometimes the most effective move is to step back, reassess, and wait for conditions to change. That restraint does not weaken a force, it strengthens it. What unfolded on the ground, however, is only one part of a much larger picture. What began on the streets around Toretsk did not end there. Days later, similar footage emerged from the Dnipro River, where Ukrainian FPV drones struck Russian patrol boats moving through what once looked like a safe water route. This event was not directly linked to Toretsk, yet it followed the same pattern. Russian forces relied on movement and distance, while Ukrainian units relied on observation, timing, and precision. Analysts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies note that Russian river patrols have become increasingly vulnerable as drones expand into waterways once considered low risk. This shift matters. It shows that Russia is losing more than vehicles or boats. It is losing safe space. Land, rivers, and supply routes are now exposed to constant surveillance and sudden strikes, while no single weapon offers protection. Modern war rewards decisions, not slogans, and precision, not myths about miracle weapons. If you want clear, grounded analysis like this, subscribe to Military Force and stay with us as this battlefield continues to change, continues to change, continues to